Great, thanks. Well, good morning to members of the Winnipeg Police Board and everyone who's watching this from home. My name's James, and I'm here representing the police abolitionist organization, Winnipeg Police Cause Harm. I'm here today to voice opposition to the proposed $9.5 million increase in operating spending and $7.1 million increase in mill rate support to the Winnipeg Police in 2022. Rather than give the Winnipeg Police yet another massive raise, which represents a 3.2% increase that's larger than any other major city department, we as an organization are calling for a 10% cut to the Winnipeg Police budget in 2022. That means that instead of spending $320 million in 2022, the police would be hard capped at $280 million, which is a $30 million reduction from 2021. Police spending in Winnipeg is completely out of control. The city has no plan to manage it, and that is quite literally true. A report requested from the city's CFO in December 2020 concerning sustainable and predictable funding for the police has still not been completed for this budget cycle. This is also confirmed every budget season when the same thing happens over and over again. Chief Smythe and the WPS claim that this problem comes down to unexpected issues like retroactive increases in police pension costs and revenue shortfalls from COVID-19. And while these issues undoubtedly complicate the financials, the police spending crisis comes down to a much more fundamental reality. The city is spending an absolutely unbelievable amount of money on the salaries and the benefits of police officers. So the Winnipeg Police is set to spend $282 million on salaries and benefits in 2022. That's the entirety of the city's mill rate contribution and more. Employing 1,944 full-time equivalents or FTEs, that works out to $145,000 per FTE, with every year seeing more cops elevated into a new pay scale. So as of today, a constable who earns $60,000 as starting salary hits $75,000 by their third year and almost $110,000 by their fifth year. Obviously, that's unthinkable for any other municipal worker. And that's just an average. In 2020, 6 senior officers earn more than the mayor, including $292,000 for Chief Smythe, not including pension payments, of course, but $145,000 is the average per FTE. Now compare that to library workers, which has upwards of 30% vacancy rates in part-time employment. So library salaries and benefits work out to only $67,000 per FTE. That's under half of what is paid to Winnipeg Police employees. If libraries were staffed at the same rate as police, salaries and benefits would still only come to $130 million for libraries. That's compared to $282 million for police. This is the root of the police spending crisis, not COVID-19 shortfalls or not even pension costs. Police costs keep rising because the city has allowed itself to be repeatedly run over during collective bargaining with the Winnipeg Police Association and refused to put hard caps on new spending. And even by the city's own metrics, this spending is not working. The annual citizen survey, which I know some councillors don't believe in, even though it's commissioned by the city, shows us clearly between 2018 and 2021, satisfaction rates with police service efforts in crime control have dropped from 84% to 70%. Within the same time frame, satisfaction rates with police response to 911 calls has plummeted from 88% to 69%. Clearance rates have also been dropping from 38% in 2015 to 33% in 2020, with only 18% of property crimes cleared in 2020. So the police keep getting paid more and more money to do less and less of what they even claim to do. Although they will never miss an opportunity for special duty policing at grocery stores and vaccine centers, which are all pensionable earnings, of course, which means more costs for the city in the future. On a purely financial basis, this is completely unsustainable and necessitates drastic change. But this is obviously far from only a financial crisis. Winnipeg police are not only failing to keep people safe, they're actively endangering people, especially poor Indigenous residents. In April 2020, in the span of only 10 days, Winnipeg police shot and killed 3 Indigenous people, Aisha Hudson, Jason Collins, and Stuart Andrews. And just yesterday, it was announced that the officer who shot and killed Stuart will not be facing any charges. Many of these families, along with families from across Canada, recently came together in Winnipeg as part of a national gathering of BIPOC families against police violence to collectively oppose this. Winnipeg police also received more international headlines during the COVID-19 pandemic due to the actions of officers like Patrol Sergeant Kevin Smith for revenge ticketing someone who asked him why he wasn't wearing a mask, and another incident where he violently berated a First Nations man, threatening him with arrest. And of course, Smith is only one of many notorious officers employed by the city who constantly use their incredible powers for extreme harm. Think of Jeffrey Norman and Sean Cassidy. Such officers have been systematically shielded from any consequences. Only last week, an anonymous 10-year veteran of the Winnipeg Police was interviewed by the far-right media outlet Rebel News, which is notorious for virulent Islamophobia and racism in opposing vaccine mandates. And there are, of course, countless and daily abuses that don't make media headlines and aren't investigated by the IIU: assaults, harassment, surveillance, intimidation, and incarceration of people who are unhoused, using criminalized substances, and living with mental health and substance use issues. These are the things that the city is getting for $320 million a year in spending. So the Winnipeg Police Board desperately needs to demand a different approach. Policing has been tried and failed at incredible human, social, and financial expense, undermining the viability of every other city service. Now, contract negotiations are clearly outside of the purview of these budget deliberations, as reminded by the recent pension fiasco, although the city should take a far harder line on that in upcoming collective bargaining processes on the principle of ability to pay, which is currently very low. But the police board does still have enormous and unrecognized power at this stage in the budget proceedings to propose a police funding cut with a hard cap, meaning no bailing out the police with another $7.3 million when they overspend. Instead of receiving authorization to spend another $9.5 million on operating expenses, which is almost entirely salaries and benefits, the police board should propose a 10% cut from 2021 levels. Practically, this will require a hiring freeze, layoffs, vacancy management, and service cuts, things that have been demanded of every other department during COVID-19. To remind you once again, libraries are currently operating at almost 40% vacancy. So this can and should start with putting the officers who are refusing to get or to disclose their COVID-19 vaccine status. In Toronto, many officers were just put on unpaid leave. So Winnipeg should follow this example. Rather than merely responding to harm after it happens, which is clearly what the discussion with Owen was just about, the police board should be promoting a reduction of criminalization and a rebuilding of life-sustaining services that actually keep people safe and in their communities before harm occurs. So these things include housing and social services, harm reduction like safe consumption sites and a safe supply of drugs, public transit, libraries, nonviolent crisis intervention that isn't involved with police, low barrier shelters and 24/7 safe spaces, adequate snow clearing of sidewalks, which I will remind council is a public safety issue, mental health and substance use resources, and preparing the city for an impending climate crisis like what has been seen and unfolding in British Columbia. Instead of the new wellness check pilot program, which is all too conveniently announced during the budget proceedings as the police are receiving another raise, wellness checks should be completely removed from the purview of police and reassigned to a non-carceral alternative. Everything that I just listed is a means of greatly increasing the safety of people in Winnipeg, helping address their real basic needs before they are forced into criminalized activities which police can only respond to. But in order to do this, the police budget needs to be cut and reallocated, not further increased. We just keep digging ourselves into a deeper and deeper hole. This means rejecting the proposed $9.5 million in proposed spending and reducing total police spending to $280 million for 2022 as a start to complete defunding and abolition of the Winnipeg Police Service. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilton. Any questions? Councillor Mays?
Hello, James. Good to see you again. You are, I think I said last year, you're one of our more eloquent and well-researched presenters, and I meant that. I don't think I have issue with any of the numbers you present. And thank you actually for presenting a defined position, the 10% cut. It's not what I'm voting for, but I appreciate it's an option that you're putting forward that's well spelled out. It's clear. So thank you for that. I guess my question, and you also rightly said we're not the ones doing the bargaining, but I guess two things. I don't have the exact number with me, but the growth in the police budget, it is continuing to grow. Completely fair comment. It is growing at a slower rate than it did, say, prior to 2015, 2016. I think if the mayor were here, he would want to point it out that the rate of increase has slowed as compared to the numbers prior to roughly 2018. I do have a second question, but I should give you the chance to respond to that.
Sure. I mean, I don't have the numbers for 2015 or 2016 in front of me, but as mentioned, the rate of increase for 2022, which is the proposed budget we're talking about today, is 3.2%. And that's larger than any other major department increase. And also because the police budget is well over $300 million, that 3.2% increase means a lot more for the police in terms of total spending than it does for, say, community services, which is just over $100 million. If community services received a 3.2% increase, which is not, it's a 1.1% increase, then that would mean a lot less for community services than it does for police. So once again, I'm not familiar with 2015 or 16 numbers, but this year's increase is 3.2%, far more than any other major city department.
I think if we mix in capital, transit might have had a bigger increase on capital, but your point, I take your point. I mean, it's well researched. I gotta push back a little though. You've disarmed me by making a somewhat right-wing argument, which is to talk about ability to pay for the employer in collective bargaining and in an arbitration environment. Because I spent much of the 90s arguing against employers making ability to pay arguments. So you'd said the city gets run over in collective bargaining. You also said we don't do that. So that's you're right on that. I don't know that the city does get run over in collective bargaining, but the resolution mechanism is not the right to strike or lockout. The resolution mechanism is arbitration. So we don't unilaterally appoint the arbitrator. But you were saying, well, the city should put forward an ability to pay argument. I have to say that's usually a right-wing critique. And I mean, I remember saying behind closed doors here once, if we're going to cry that we don't have the ability to pay, maybe we should take out that page of the budget book that says we have the lowest property taxes in the country on the average home, because I mean, I'd have loved that if I worked for MGU or somebody like that. I'd have just hammered the city on the ability to pay. I get your point, and you're not saying we're the ones bargaining. I get that, but I have to say, I mean, Taves's critique a while ago was get paid what you get paid. There should just be fewer of you. It's a position, but I think that's what it almost has to come down to. I don't think we don't have the unilateral right to lower wages, obviously. I was right to pat myself on the back, but I was saying we don't have the unilateral right to change the pension plan. Arbitrator agreed with that. So it's in bargaining, but I should give you a chance to respond to this. I mean, we don't do the bargaining, but I just got to say that I don't think the city's let itself be run over. It to some extent, it goes to an arbitrator, and the harder line would be, I think, you can have a 5% wage increase. There'll be 200 fewer of you. There, that's our position. I mean, that moment has never come here. I think that's really the debate that would have to happen if you wanted to crush down the wage and benefit bill. But I should give you a chance to respond to all that.
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of pieces to that. In terms of lack of ability to pay, I do think that this is a reality within Winnipeg. In 2000, the percentage of operating budget that was spent on policing was 16.9%, 16.9, and the proposed budget is 26.8%. So that is a massive increase. And I think that seriously compromises ability to pay. I think that's a real argument. Secondly, this is not related directly to my presentation. I think the conversation about property tax increases should probably be had by council, but that's not specific to my presentation. Yes, the police board is not in bargaining, but I do think that there's a lot of things that the police board does have the power to do, such as cap spending, which is what I'm proposing today with the 10% reduction. And to your point about there being fewer officers being paid more, I would argue that's exactly what happens. Winnipeg police will often talk about the loss of officers to population, which based on their graphical presentations and their statistical reports is quite overstated. I think it's reduced from about 200 to 177 in the past several years. But this has not been a total loss of employment. What's been happening is a civilianization of employment. And so we've been seeing, rather than police officers being hired, which is still absolutely happening with new cadet classes happening constantly, a lot of these positions are being shifted into civilianization, which means less spending. So that is like one response to what you're kind of illustrating in your point, and I think that should be accelerated. Obviously, the proposal of mass layoffs is one that the city is not unfamiliar to with other departments, and I don't think the police should be shielded from these sort of tactics, which are used for every other department. So, for example, once again, with library facing 30 to 40% vacancy management, or transit experiencing a 6% service cut, these are just assumed to be what has to happen for other departments in order for the police to be able to continue to be funded at the level that they are. And kind of the gist, hopefully it was somewhat apparent throughout my presentation, but I would argue that all of these things are also public safety issues. So for someone to be able to have a bus show up on time and not to be, standing out in the cold for 30 to 40 minutes, that's a public safety issue. For people to be able to use library resources, people who may not have a computer or access to Amazon to buy books to be delivered to their home, that's a public safety issue. And so I think that this is like, so the way that these other departments have been approached needs to be similarly applied to policing. And finally, I'll just say, in response to your critique that ability to pay is a right-wing argument, I don't personally believe that policing is a public service equivalent to others. So I don't think it's equivalent to community services. I don't believe it's equivalent to transit or public works or sewage or wastewater or any of these. I believe that the police are a harmful institution, and that it would serve other municipal unions well to reject their association with the Winnipeg Police Association, which continues to gobble up more and more of the budget and undermine their ability to function as other city departments. So that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. And we did one final comment. We had a debate last year that I think had some productive use this year, which was there was a survey done last year. You cited it. I said, well, it wasn't scientific. People gamed it. Good for them. I'd have done that myself if I were. But to which you basically said, then why'd you do the survey? Don't discredit the stuff you're doing. So this year we did try to do a statistically valid survey. I think rather unfortunately, the category was public safety, which could lump together any number of it. Some might say it's policing, some might say it's not having police. So at least we didn't have the same argument we had last year. So we're, I think, doing a little better job at surveying the public. So I think it was a
For
fair.
sure. And if I may just add just briefly, that the number one service that has been highlighted by Winnipeg residents is housing and social services. So that was the number one priority. And I understand that some members of council, I believe, including the mayor, have suggested that housing is not within the purview of municipal affairs. And I would say that it's clearly, I mean, it's within the survey, so I don't know how that would be categorized exactly. But also, I think that the city can take a very proactive, needs to take a very proactive role to questions of housing and social services. And one other thing about the survey is that you'll note from the past, I think it was even 2 or 3 years ago, that the number one support for police or crime, or however it's been defined, has been drastically dropped to about what average many other services are. So, you know, we can talk about the methodologies of the survey collection another day, but I'll just flag that housing and social services has been identified as a key issue for many Winnipeggers. And I think that the police board and council more broadly should build funding and policy around that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Wilden. I have a couple of questions myself, and you talked about housing and homelessness, and it is top of mind for a lot of Winnipeggers. I note that just, I believe it was last night, actually, 190 Disraeli opened up 150 beds. I saw a news story on the other night, just a warm night's sleep in the Osborne Village area. Opened up low barrier stays that provides 45 beds. They provide showering. They provide a warm meal for individuals who are homeless. I note that Main Street Project has also increased their bed space, and Salome Mission is also working to increase their bed space. So lots more work to be done. I completely agree. There's also the 211 service that's now come online. Although it's not a dispatchable service, it does connect people with resources, whether it's an individual trying to find resources for a person in crisis, or a person themselves in crisis can be connected with resources. So yes, still lots of work to be done, because on any given night, there is approximately 1,500 unsheltered Winnipeggers. But, between the city of Winnipeg, the federal government, we're working diligently to increase rapid housing initiatives throughout the city and making sure that there are spaces for individuals who are unsheltered in our city.
Yeah, and if I may just respond briefly, I think that's really terrific news. From what I understand, the 190 or 192 Disraeli was open with $1.5 million in provincial spending. I don't know what the municipal engagement is on that front, but I think this is an example exactly of sort of the life-sustaining service that our group is trying to propose as an alternative. With a 10% reduction in police spending, far more could be directed towards this kind of thing. Because ultimately, like, housing is such an important public safety solution for the reasons that you just kind of outlined, is that with so many people unhoused every night, that's, people are at risk of freezing or death. And so that's a real issue that I think can be confronted not only with these sorts of emergency shelter situations, but with investment in like public housing. And so that's something that I would really encourage the city to continue thinking about and investing in, even though I understand that jurisdiction is often appealed to as a reason not to do that. But these kind of projects are examples of what can be done and why that's really important. So yeah, those are great examples.
Well, glad we're singing from the same song sheet then on that issue. With respect to, again, budgets, and you did talk about overtime, and I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look at item 5 on that's on our decision-making information system and the third quarter financial report. But overtime is actually reduced and has been very effectively managed by the service in terms of trying to reduce those costs in an effective and efficient manner. Care to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah. I'm just pulling up the numbers now, but overtime reduction is great. It's really important, not only for immediate pay, but also for pensionable earnings, which I realize are a big consideration for the city. So that's great, and that should be capped at a lower rate with the intention of phasing out, because overtime really it's like an extremely expensive process, as I'm sure everyone knows, especially at the high rates at which officers are paid. So that's good progress, and I would encourage the police board to send those price signals, to use sort of economistic language, to the police department to continue to do that. We can't just count on the police to continue to make their own spending cuts, even though there's this $3 million in expenditure management. As we just saw recently, overspending can happen very quickly.
How much did you say?
3.
3? Okay.
3 is what's in the budget.
Okay. So you did speak about in terms of the budget, that the 2022 budget, that it's increasing to 3.2%. We're in a 4-year multi-year budget, and the targets are 2%. So that's the guideline that the service was asked to work within in terms of the creation of this budget. It is 2% increase as opposed to the 3.2% increase that you're stating. Can you elaborate how you came to?
Yeah, page 239 of the operating budget tax supported summary. It says very clearly 3.2% net variance from 2021. So unless the budget reporting is incorrect, that's the number I'm working with.
Okay. Capital is mixed in there as well.
Yeah, well, capital is spending. Like if something is spent on capital, it's still spending that the city is authorizing and directly funding through mill rate. So 3.2 is 3.2.
Okay, so, and in terms of looking at the capital that is to be spent, I mean, that's not on police officers. That is some of the equipment used for the purposes of providing public safety.
Oh yeah, well aware, like the robot dog and the drones and the tank and the helicopter.
Well, and that's outside because in terms of, and you mentioned the robot dog, that is proceeds of crime that is outside of this capital budget, that those funds are received through proceeds of crime and not part of this budget.
That's still revenue, like service revenue, whether it's photo radar or proceeds of crime, which I would say is confiscated goods that belong to people. That should be going to the public coffers, and that should be, in the case of like photo radar, which.
And sorry to cut you short, but that's the service applies for those dollars through a grant program to the provincial government for those dollars, and those dollars are then used for the purposes of those capital expenditures.
Well, the city should do the same thing that the province is doing during the ULFA negotiations, and for every dollar that's awarded to the police from the province, the city should cut the same amount of money.
Okay, well, that's certainly a direction that you can present or argue or articulate. But again, the purpose of the robot dog is for to keep officers and the public safe, including their own service dogs that go into situations where there's potential harm that could come to an officer, to a citizen, or to a service dog. And the associated cost in retraining a dog that's injured in the line of duty is a lot more expensive than the cost of a robot dog.
Well, I would personally say, and as on behalf of the organization, no more surveillance gadgets, whether it's the drones, whether it's the robot dogs, whether it's any of these. Also reminds police board that when the armored vehicle, aka tank, was bought, that was done without permission from the police board itself. And so the police clearly feel like they have quite a lot of room to move on this. And I would say just no more spending, no more of that kind of capital spending. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that. But we also need to recognize the fact that our city is also growing, not only growing in population size, but also growing in land space. When you look at areas like Amber Trails, Sage Creek in Councillor Mays's ward, Waverly West, they're further, our city's expanding in size geographically. And so that does have an impact on resources as well.
Sure, which is itself a massive crisis. And I would really encourage, this is not within the police board purview, but I think that's a huge issue in terms of suburban sprawl, especially during a climate crisis when we're facing, who knows what we've been seeing in BC. That's a side point. But in terms of actual responsible allocation of resources, this is what I've been calling for throughout, is that police investments is not a good investment, and that we need to be reallocating that budget towards services that actually work. And so regardless of how big the city is, regardless of the population, we know that what we're currently funding through the police budget is not working, and we need to try other solutions, such as nonviolent crisis response, such as public housing, such as harm reduction, like safe consumption sites and safe supply, such as public transit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So, yeah, and you touched on a good point there, nonviolent crisis response. On Monday, there was a press release with respect to the alternative response for citizens in crisis and the approach that's taken there through a multidisciplinary team, and looking at that as a pilot in terms of how we deal with citizens in crisis. So, initiatives are being undertaken to address the concerns that you've raised and others have raised in terms of making sure that individuals that are in crisis with mental health or addictions have an alternative response and a better outcome to their crisis.
With respect, I don't think that that kind of service should be provided by police at all. I think that should be completely parceled out to an organization which has nothing to do with the police. And this is something that a lot of mental health advocates have been calling for a very long time, because we know that wellness checks are the #1 response in Winnipeg and many other places. And that many people do not feel safe when police, whether they're plainclothes or not, show up at their door. It changes the dynamic enormously. It can lead to escalations. It can lead to a lot of issues, including people being shot and killed. And so I don't think that is an appropriate response to mental health or substance use issues. I think that this needs to be parceled out entirely. And this is what speaks to my argument about cutting and reallocating the budget. the police have far too much power and funding in the city, and that needs to change. And so, yes, the project, which I once again will suggest is very conveniently timed to be in the middle of budget proceedings, should be done by organizations which are not police.
Well, and to that point, this multidisciplinary team is something that the city has been working on in terms of the Harvard Bloomberg study. I recall earlier this summer, which was not part of the budget process, Inspector Chris Puhatch meeting with the Winnipeg Police Board, with the chief, and talking about this program, and now it's being implemented. So there's no convenience around it in terms of it, or nefarious in terms of it being announced during a budget cycle. This is something that we've been working on at least for the last year, and its implementation is now coming to fruition in terms of implementation. So
sure, I'm not implying conspiracy. I'm just saying it is convenient for the police to have this kind of positive headlines as it is set to receive millions more in spending this year.
Well, they're in terms of that program, they're finding the resources within their own budget to fund these positions. So.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not suggesting that that's new spending. And Chief Smythe said, I can't recall the exact language, but it was definitely implied that this was a very bare bones, just like kind of throwing together whatever extra resources they have, which I found very comical, given that the department is set to get $320 million and 26.8% of the operating budget this year. If this is something that is to be taken seriously, which again should not involve police, this needs to be well funded by the city, not something that is just parceled together, with sort of like leftover resources.
Well, then, in that response that you've provided, I implore you to make that argument to the city in the correspondence, and perhaps in the Protection, Community Services, and Parks, or Parks, Community Services and Protection Standing Policy Committee, to make that argument there that the city should be funding or putting funding towards those services. And again, I agree in terms of 211, it's more resource linking as opposed to dispatchable service. I do like the components of it. United Way, which I spent 6 years as a Board of Trustee member on, and learned an immeasurable amount of information in terms of public response. Starting my career with the Provincial Government and Family Services, the Department of Employment and Income Assistance, and learning how to deliver services to those most vulnerable in our city. So again, I implore you to make that argument to the City of Winnipeg in terms of PCSP, and looking at additional funding for programs like this that help citizens in crisis. I listed off a whole list of different resources in terms of individuals who are experiencing homelessness that we're trying to address, and the argument could be made that it should be other levels of government that should be facilitating these processes and programs, but we recognize that it does have an impact on city resources, including fire, paramedics, and City of Winnipeg Police. So
yeah, for sure, and I appreciate that. I'll just say that presenting a PCSP or EPC or wherever is great and important, and I intend to do that as well. But in order for the police, in order for the city to have the appropriate budget in order to spend on these alternative solutions, the police budget needs to be cut. And that's what I'm here proposing today, because so long as the city only has a 2.33% property tax increase every year, and as long as the city keeps putting over $300 million towards the operating budget of the police every single year, then these options are not going to be available. They're going to continue to be shoestring, and the resources that are, like you say, important, smart, responsive, like all these sorts of things, are going to continue to be underfunded. And so that's why we as an organization are calling for a 10% cut to Winnipeg Police, reallocation to life-sustaining services, like all the ones that you just mentioned.
Again, thank you for your presentation this morning, Mr. Wilt. It's always an inspiring debate in terms of when you're presenting to us. And I encourage you to, if you have time, to continue on and viewing the presentation of the Winnipeg Police Board this morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Any other questions, board members? Not seeing none. We'll move on to reports. Thank you again.